Hi, everybody. You are cordially welcome to our discussion today around venture capital and its responsibilities to digital rights, technology. My name is Sudar Yao. I am the head of Lucid Capitalism, an ESG advisory firm that's focused on climate and social justice education for large for-profit institutions like venture capital and private equity firms. And I'm joined today by two incredible panelists I could not be more excited to introduce to you. In terms of quick agenda, we'll do a lightning fast round of introductions, and then hopefully get John and Michael, two brilliant men who work in exactly the same space, but from completely different sides of the ecosystem, to light up your screen with sparks of affection, of confrontation. I'm hoping that this is a very lively debate. And just so everyone knows, we've all been speaking for about a couple of weeks on different very salient topics. So if you have questions that we're not addressing, please post them on the Twitter handle, because very likely it's something we want to discuss as well. So with that, I will turn it to my panelists. John, do you want to give a quick introduction to your background and your work with RIL?
Sure. Sudar, thanks so much. Really excited to be here. And Michael, thanks to you as well. Looking forward to the conversation. I am John Zieger. I'm the executive director and one of the co-founders of Responsible Innovation Labs, which is a nonprofit organization working to create standards of responsible behavior for the technology industry and for investors in the technology industry. We can talk more in the conversation about what that means. Before that, I was the general counsel of a company called Stripe, which is at this point, one of the largest financial technology companies in the world. Before that, I spent about a decade at Microsoft on consumer online services and started my career in kind of the first .com boom as a lawyer for the technology industry. So very much lifelong, or at least career-long technology guy.
Thanks, John. Michael, to you.
Thank you. And again, thank you for everyone who's attending, and Sudar and John. I'm really looking forward to this. My name is Michael Kleinman, and I am the Director of Technology and Human Rights for Amnesty International USA. Amnesty International is one of the world's largest human rights organizations, and we look at the human rights implications of tech, of big tech, and of what's sort of coming down the pike. What are going to be the human rights implications of technologies that are being developed and deployed today? Prior to Amnesty, I had a long and winding road. I worked for humanitarian organizations overseas in Afghanistan, across East and Central Africa, and in Iraq. And then I worked for a foundation, one of Piero Midyar's foundations, so funding both work to support peace building and conflict resolution, as well as some early work around tech and human rights. And then I made the curious choice, because I live in San Francisco and it seemed to be what everyone was doing, to start a company providing mobile phone survey services to UN agencies in war zones. And if anyone wants to start a company that whose business model relies on UN invoicing, I'd love to have a long conversation with you about some of the problems with that. It was an interesting ride. And then 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to join Amnesty to lead their work on tech and human rights in Silicon Valley. And again, thank you guys so much for joining today.
Fantastic. So just quick caveats, right? And I'll keep exposition short because I want to make sure that we have really time for a fruitful conversation. I will highlight that this is a panel dominated by white men in Silicon Valley on Women's Day for Mozilla Fest. So we get that we are not the audience. We are not the audience representatives necessarily, but this is going to be a conversation not focused on the problem statement, but really on where the problem is coming from, which I think we can agree that perhaps the aforementioned demographic in Silicon Valley bears a bit more responsibility for around responsible technology. And I could not be more thrilled with having composed this specific panel because of these gentlemen's backgrounds, which are in some ways so dissonant and in yet many ways really interlocking, right? Just to recover, John, with a lot of modesty, is not describing that he was there at Amazon's IPO, right? We're talking about an OG tech guy who was around for the first boom, right? Who's seen Web 1, who's seen Web 2, and is now looking with perhaps a bit of circumspection around Web 3. We're talking about a lawyer who has not only had his own startup, really focused on technology for really well-intentioned multilaterals, but is also now looking at this with a great deal of I think, self-awareness from a fairly neo-colonialist NGO like Amnesty International. So we have not only a guy who spent a better part of a decade working around antitrust issues at Microsoft, who then built one of the largest fintech decacorns of history, but also someone who's been throwing some exciting Molotov cocktails at the VC funds that have funded said fintech unicorns in the past. So very interesting coming together of two worlds here. So with no further ado, my quick background is I spent about half of a decade in the investment banking world, doing leveraged buyouts, M&A, and then trying to do good like microfinance funding and green bonds at Citigroup, JP Morgan, and the World Bank. Then spent better part of a decade on the impact investing nonprofit side. And the reason why I'm here today is because I find myself in a very unpopulated intersection point between being able to speak to brilliant venture capitalists, brilliant mission-driven founders, and fantastic NGO organizations, and actually intermediating, translating between those three different groups. A number of my VC clients are actually GPs that are very actively trying to focus on what does responsible technology look like as we are experiencing pretty exciting and groundbreaking changes around privacy, misinformation, cybersecurity, right? And so this is a very salient conversation. So with that, I would love, John, for you to do a quick introduction of your work at RIL and maybe a bit on how your background at Microsoft and at Stripe sort of brought you to the 6 pillars that RIL is founded on, because that is quite unique.
Sudar, I appreciate that, and thanks for the additional color on the background. So Responsible Innovation Labs really came out of a series of conversations that I had after I left Stripe with a number of folks around the industry, but in particular, my co-founders, Hemant Taneja, who is the managing director of the General Catalyst venture capital firm, and Dita Van Lamone, who was also early Stripe and went on to found a unicorn health technology company, Camure, and is a close friend. Out of kind of a shared thesis and a shared experience, which is, I think if you look at the shape of the world today, and certainly project forward the trends that we see, it is disproportionately shaped by technology companies, right? What our economic opportunities are, how we perceive information, all of these things, how we interact with our government, these are increasingly determined by and mediated by technology, and it's creating opportunities. But it's also creating significant problems, and that won't be a surprise to anybody that's listening to this conversation today. But I think what we, if you think about technological change driven by ambitious, largely venture-backed companies as being a kind of superpower for the world, right? It is a way to bring things to scale, new technologies to scale and distribute them rapidly. That is super important for the world. The question is, how do you, for us, was how do we leverage that superpower, but create guardrails, right? So that it is channeled toward things that are societally beneficial, and that we avoid more of the unintended consequences than we have in the past. And so that's really the kind of the mission or the idea behind Responsible Innovation Labs. you can situate, I think when you think about critics of the technology industry, really any industry, you can situate them on a bit of a continuum, or in different locations. There are some that are outside of the industry, right? That are, and I think Amnesty, Michael, you can correct that. I think Amnesty is, is sort of in that right? You're firmly outside of the industry, a historic NGO. And calling, sort of lobbing in criticism and calling the industry up to certain different ways of thinking about things. There are others that are firmly inside of the industry, and I would situate us as inside of the industry, right? In that kind of dynamic, right? We are looking to shape a better technology industry from inside, and we're going to do that through a set of standards and a variety of tools and other things, and we can maybe touch on some of the methods over time. But you asked, sort of how does my experience at Stripe and Microsoft inform that? We have these sort of five, broadly kind of five pillars. You could organize these in a whole bunch of different ways: promoting economic inclusion, building sustainably, respecting people, which is around things like security and privacy, championing diversity, and strengthening democracy. And these are all areas that, for me, as a general counsel, as a senior lawyer at Microsoft, were ones where I spent a lot of time. And in particular, these democracy issues were ones that came up a lot. Whether it was funding, at Stripe, dealing with the funding of various right-wing parties, or other groups that were potentially associated with violent extremism. At Microsoft, dealing with issues with the Chinese government and search results and those kinds of things. It's a repeated issue, and obviously not an easy one, but it's one that we felt like there was an enormous opportunity to create industry solutions and industry frameworks so that every company isn't making it up on their own, and that we could really leverage the power of the collective. So I'll sort of stop there. That was sort of what led to it. And I can go into more detail, but I'll pass it back to you.
No, I definitely want you to. I think a takeaway here for anyone who's not familiar with Responsible Innovation Labs, which is a nonprofit and is an industry-led organization with strong backing from at least one really noteworthy venture capital firm, is that there is a desire to step into ownership and accountability here, right? And that there are early tech leaders like yourselves who are going to choose one term sheet from a venture capital firm over another based on the kind of awareness and thoughtfulness around social and environmental issues and justice issues that perhaps were not part of decision-making, call it 5-10 years ago, when, before the BLM movement kind of had a resurgence, before climate change was really thoughtful. So I think of what you and the CEO of Warby Parker and Gusto as kind of the carrot that brings venture capital to this table. Let's talk for a moment about the stick. So Michael wrote a beautiful paper, which we'll be sending out later. The link is also on this post's website, kind of lobbying 50 Molotov cocktails at the top 50 venture capital firms in the United States. Michael, just a really quick summary of that report and the reception. It was published last August, way before General Catalyst and RIL got off the ground. So this is no criticism of John's work, but could you have expected the reaction that you got? And where do you go from here, knowing that there are industry insiders like John and the team at GC that are trying to step into more ownership?
So the reason that we wrote this report that looked at the human rights due diligence of venture capital was it's incredibly hard to shape the human rights practices of a company once they reach hyperscale. And so if we want to make sure that we have companies that are rights respecting, the earlier we can start to have that conversation, the earlier they can bake in those policies and processes, the better. And VCs, as you all well know, have tremendous influence and leverage across the entire startup ecosystem. And so if we really want to ensure that the next generation of massive companies are rights respecting, then VCs, more than almost any other actor, have the power to make that happen in terms of what they're looking for when they invest. And then once they have made an investment, what kinds of pressure they put and what kinds of requirements they put on the companies in which they're invested.
Michael, I'm going to jump in here. Give me some concrete examples here, right? And I don't want this just to be, Sudar moderating. So John, dive in here. What do you think would have changed differently? Would we have had the global gig economy grow if Uber had been invested in by VC funds with very different investment theses around social justice, right? Give me some tangible examples here as to what you mean.
That's a great question. And I think that what we would have seen would have been a lot more focus on the labor rights, the privacy rights, and the free expression rights of these technologies and these business models at a much earlier stage. So labor rights when it comes to the gig economy, privacy rights when it comes to the entire surveillance capitalism business model that powers companies like Facebook. And it's not that we can perfectly predict exactly what's going to happen. What is incredibly concerning is that we haven't even made the attempt to think about some of the negative consequences. So we're not saying that a human rights due diligence policy means that we will magically be able to look into the future and say, this will happen, here's how to avoid it. What we're saying is that it's a dereliction of duty to not even make that attempt, especially because we have 20 years of experience through Web 1 and Web 2 with what negative consequences can look like. And VCs pride themselves on pattern matching. And it's a real shame that there's not that same level of attention to sort of what kinds of patterns of negative consequences have we seen before, and what might that mean going forward. So that was why we're thinking, well, okay, let's look at the venture capital sector. Are they doing any human rights due diligence? Are they trying to think about, in any systemic way, what the negative consequences of their investments might be before they make them? And the answer overwhelmingly is no. As Sudar alluded to, we surveyed 50 of the largest VC firms and 3 leading tech accelerators, basically asking, do you conduct any human rights due diligence whatsoever? One firm conducted human rights due diligence that met the minimum standards set forth in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. 8 firms had some level of policy, but did not meet those standards. And then the balance, 83% of our sample, no evidence whatsoever that they were conducting any human rights due diligence. And that's what we not only want to call attention to, but that's what needs to change. And I very much agree with John in terms of responsible innovation. And I think that we do share a lot of the same viewpoint that we can't continue to just blindly rush forward without spending any time thinking about the consequences of these investments.
And it's interesting because that one actor that you described is UK based, right? And it's broadly seen that Europe and the UK are a bit farther ahead than the United States, where frankly, the bulk of technology is still being created in Silicon Valley. When I hear you say words like dereliction of duty, my CRO, my chief risk officer, my GC spider senses start tingling. And John, right, this was your job at both Microsoft and at Stripe, right? You were in the room deciding who the early VC investors were going to be in Stripe's cap table. You had a decision-making power around which GPs you wanted to partner with, not just over the course of 1 or 2 funding cycles, but across Stripe's incredible international growth and then undisputed dominance now of the fintech space, right? So when you think about fiduciary duty from an LP to a GP and then portfolio level and then to the GC position, right? How do you think about that supply chain and that sort of risk return profile, right? Because let's be honest, this is an asset class where you're not getting a lot of LP pressure, right? CalPERS, CalSTRS, TIA, CREF, Ontario Pension Fund, they're not focused on VC right now. They've got more than enough to worry about in the public capital markets. Their ESG, ETFs, they might be starting to think about private equity. They might be starting to think about growth equity. No one is focused on the next Stripe, on the next Uber, on the next Amazon. Founders like you, though, right? Early investors, I mean, first 10 employees of Stripe, like yourselves, got to decide who you wanted to have in your cap table. How do you think about this term, dereliction of duty, around human rights, right?
Yeah.
How are your spider senses tingling?
Right. No, there's so much to say there. Michael, I'm glad you're not going to be provocative here in this conversation. Look, I mean, I understand the point, and I don't. At some level, I think this is a question of evolution of the market. And so, from a sort of purely kind of legal and risk side, just put my rusty or dusty lawyer hat on for a second. I don't think human rights diligence is at this point a standard. So I'm guessing the general counsels of various venture firms will not view themselves as violating their fiduciary duties for failing to do it. Nevertheless, I mean, it doesn't, I think, obviate the core point. And so I think that's probably worth addressing. It seems to me one of the things that's worth kind of just being explicit about is we have been for a considerable time, at least most of the last decade, in an oversupplied capital market with scarce returns. And that dynamic is very important to this. And so we think about venture, we talk about the power of venture firms, and they do have power. And I don't want to, but the reality is they have much less power than we might think they do. The scarcest resource in the kind of innovation ecosystem is high quality founders. That's the scarce resource. It's not ideas, it's not capital, it's high quality founders. And the trend that you have seen in, and this was true at Stripe, we were a beneficiary of this, but this is true of the market. Pretty active angel investor. He's talked to lots and lots of venture firms. The trend has been toward founder centricity, right? And what founder centricity looks like in practice is we give you money, we give you connections, and we largely stay out of your way. That is mostly true of the top venture firms. Now, I don't think it's true of everyone. I think that some of the best firms really kind of fulfill their promise of providing high quality advice and kind of sort of founder services. But largely, I think what the dynamic is that the best founders can decide who their investors are. And that's really where the power sits, and that shapes a lot of what happens in these deals. Now, I don't want to belabor that. I probably already spent too much time on it, but I think when we think about where leverage lies and where the ability to kind of constrain some of these things, I think you kind of have to take that into account. And maybe they'll change over time, but I think it's at least true now.
I'd like to push back on that because I think it's important to distinguish between the VC sector as a whole and leading VC firms. Because I think that, yes, if you are a second or third tier firm, you have a lot less leverage than you once did. But I think if we're looking at the top 10, 15, 20, 25 firms, if anything, they have even more influence than in the past, both in terms of the amount of resources that they're deploying, in the ways that they're changing the ways in which those resources are deployed. If you look at Tiger and sort of the way that they've disrupted the way that the VCs have traditionally, at least the timescale in which VCs have traditionally operated, and also just the prestige factor. I mean, founders still want a check from Andreessen or Sequoia. And that's the reason that our report focused on the top 50 firms, because we still believe that they do still have a tremendous amount of influence. And it's influence that's felt not just in terms of the decisions they make, but whether it's FOMO or anything else, we do think that their actions influence what other firms do as well.
I want to bifurcate this dynamic, right? Because I think there are two things at play, right? So just to finish on John's thought, I very much agree that integrity and mission-driven founders, not necessarily what we would call social enterprise CEOs, but folk that are building tech firms, but want to do so with very egalitarian principles behind them, right? I'm talking about Jeff Lawson from Twilio, right? Who's been a big proponent of the work of Startups in Society Initiative, a really exciting nonprofit that is focused on helping founders that care about the world actually align their business model and their cap tables around their values, right? That is, I agree, the carrot that gets everyone sort of to the table, because the fight for the best founders, John, I think, is in many ways going to become more pronounced now that we see this tech pullback from the stock market. We're seeing inflation. We're just seeing a lot of valuations come down, right? A lot fewer big flowing term sheets of 200 million Series A, right? But Michael, I kind of think that your point here is a fair one, right? What obligation do the largest VC funds that have, I think that they would even agree, over the last 20 years, experienced very little regulatory constraint, very little LP pressure? What responsibility do they have? I have a view as an advisor to some of these GPs, but John, I'd love to turn it to you to first maybe describe some of the work that you're doing to build voluntary training programs and materials to help equip these GPs. And then we can maybe talk a little bit more about how to hold them accountable as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a bunch of points there I agree with, and I think I don't want to overstate the lack of power. I agree with you, Michael. I think the top VC firms are differentiated here, and that certainly has been our focus. I think there is a recognition by many of the top venture firms, or at least partners within the top venture firms, that the dynamic, the entirely kind of unregulated, we all make our own decisions, and it, it's just about returns, that approach to the world can't persist indefinitely. And whether that's for reasons of their own altruism, which I think is true of some partners, whether it's simply looking back at a Roger McNamee, looking back and saying, hey, I'm really, the returns were great, but I'm really sorry that I was associated with that thing, right? I think that that pattern certainly has been there. So some of it is just people learning lessons or their own altruism. Some of it, I think, is a recognition of the fact that sort of ESG is coming for investing generally, right? And it's mostly in the public markets right now. But increasingly, one of the reasons why, so as you said before, there's been very little LP pressure to date, or at least comparatively little LP pressure to date, is one, they've had their hands full in the public markets, and some of the biggest stories, whether it's Facebook or whatever, have absorbed a lot of that energy. But I think it's also true that the whole class of venture is a very hard place for LPs to kind of put pressure on. And this is where I think what we're doing kind of comes in, right? I think fundamentally, there's so little transparency in early stage tech companies and venture-backed companies. And there are no standards. There is no sense of what good looks like in early stage technology companies. Public company ESG standards may be relevant, but they're certainly not directly applicable to early stage technology companies, right? And so what we're really looking to do is, starting with firms that, as with any kind of early adoption curve, people have their own reasons for being kind of first out of the gate, and partners like GC are a good example of this. Partner altruism, firm kind of mission, various reasons, want to pivot their business toward more responsible investing, and that is, if you think about the reasons for that, some of it is a pure sense of what we as a firm want to accomplish. If you're one of these firms, some of it is risk avoidance. Some of it is responding to specific LP pressure. We talk about LPs as though they were all fungible, but each of these venture firms has their own mix of LPs, right? Has particular, endowments, particular pension plans that have different points of view, and they're managing on the investor relations side all of that. And so what we want to do is go to firms that are starting to care about this, and begin to arm them with tools that they can incorporate into their investing process and their founder education process and their governance programs, to start to make responsible innovation a part of the relationship that they have with their portfolio companies. So that starts with us building some standards. What does good look like? And we've got those 5 pillars. We're kind of building out some standards around that. It starts with incorporating it into the conversations that the VCs are having, at the earliest stage where investors are having conversations with founders, asking questions. Michael, I don't know if you would characterize this as human rights due diligence per se, but beginning to have open questions about what do you think the impacts of this are going to be on the world if it scales? How could it be misused? How could people be hurt by it? Let's start to apply both our kind of imaginations and sort of understanding as to where this might go, to ask those questions. And so we want to create materials, trainings, and other things that help firms do that, and that's what we're focused on.
I think what's fascinating about this conversation in some ways is how much common ground there is, and that can in some ways make for a bit of a less fireworks perhaps than Sudhir was hoping for, because no one here is arguing that VC firms should ignore the human rights implications or the ESG implications of what they're doing. No one here is wearing a Milton Friedman hat saying it's all about returns. None of the rest of this matters. And in some ways, that means that my side has won. Because as soon as we all accept that
we've all won, Michael. And that's the wrong attitude, right? If we can get GPs to think in a long-term basis, haven't they won? Haven't their LPs won?
Hold on for one second. I will get there. But once we've all accepted that human rights are important, then we can talk about what that actually means. The hardest step is going to quote Peter Thiel, from 0 to 1. So once we get to the point where most of us are like, all right, we at least have to deal with human rights, that's a huge step forward. And the reason, as I said, my side has won beyond just a semi-healthy level of narcissism, which sometimes gets out of control, is I think there is an area of disagreement. And I think that's something that's really interesting to focus on. And I think the level of disagreement is around self-regulation. So, John, if I understand correctly, in terms of intended consequences, the book that Hemant wrote, and Responsible Innovation Labs, your thesis seems to be that the industry can reform itself. And that sort of responsible innovation is something that, out of enlightened self-interest, we can assume that most VC firms will eventually come around to. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I'd say that's exactly correct. No, I mean, look, I think there is meaningful industry self-regulation that can and will need to be done. I don't think we can depend on governmental regulation alone to achieve the outcomes we want, for a bunch of reasons that I'm happy to I think government is sort of ill-equipped, both in terms of the timescale of its regulatory process, its ability to be sufficiently close to the evolution of the technology itself, and a variety of other reasons. I think it's ill-equipped to effectively regulate the technology industry without having its own pretty massive unintended consequences, which is to dramatically slow regulation,
slow innovation.
Slow innovation.
Yeah.
Slow regulation will slow innovation. To slow innovation, but they obviously need to work together. I don't think certainly. My position on this would not be that there is not a role for regulation. There clearly is, but I don't think that role is going to be the sole solve for this problem.
I'm going to help John dive in front of that bullet, but also caveat that General Catalyst is not a client of my practice. And here I'm reading from John's co-founder's new book, page 110. And let's ground this, right? So we've had a lot of really interesting conversation, but we're not diving into specific issue areas. This one from Hemant at GC, specifically on AI, he's asking for a federal AI agency. He says Washington should bring in AI experts from the tech industry to a federalized agency designed to understand and direct AI and to inform lawmakers. So here you have it from unarguably one of the most influential Midas list kingmakers that you need to bring government into the table. So I hear what you're saying, Michael, but I would push back and say that not every BCGP believes in industry-led progress, that some are more embracing of bringing in regulatory legislative partnership. How do we encourage more of that? What do you guys think, right? Because we're sitting at the precipice of the SEC coming out and saying they're going to get more involved around climate change. They're going to get more involved around diversity. Where I'm watching very closely what happens on Thursday when hopefully, well, touch wood, there will be some changes to how the FTC's political support in DC has shifted, which could change a number of things for the technology industry, right? Because Lisa Khan has been so public around her perspectives of the FANG companies, right? And agreed that this is all very late stage, right? We're talking about like Series D or publicly traded companies. But since there is a knock-on effect to earlier and earlier companies, right? The guys that are, you know, pre-seed or Series A invested, what do you guys think is in the art of the possible in terms of getting regulators and policymakers in DC involved? Do we need more GPs asking for federal AI agencies like GC is doing here?
After you, John, I'm happy to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are. It's difficult to talk in the abstract about this, right? The specific issues matter, and so I'll set the federal AI agency to one side. I actually think that most of these issues will end up being regulated in the context of, as we have tended to do with technology in the U.S., in the context of specific industries. So the use of AI in healthcare will be regulated, right? As privacy data has been regulated, or healthcare data has been regulated for privacy purposes differently in the US than it has in other spaces, right? In the financial services industry, the use of AI in credit decisions will be regulated, these kinds of things, right? You see this both here and elsewhere in the world. And I think that will I think that the extension of existing regulatory regimes to new technologies is a necessary and welcome thing. I think in general, companies where there is clear regulation of well understood things, companies can build to products and services to those constraints, and that's a good thing for both for the market and for society. So I don't think there's any problem with that. I think it's a good thing. Where we have seen, I think, much less effectiveness of regulation and a kind of stifling of innovation is where governments are regulating in spaces where technology is not well developed, right? And so you see the regulating ahead of technology, which has generally been the kind of European pattern to the regulation of technology, is to be fairly early to try to anticipate the direction of technology and kind of get ahead of it with large directives and then a comprehensive regulatory approach. And it tends not to work very well. It tends to either miss the mark or squeeze innovation to other parts of the world. And I think, so I guess that's my general sense, is like there is plenty of room for regulation. It just needs to be good regulation that makes sense, where our headlights reach far enough to be able to see the direction of technology, not further than they reach.
can I push back though, John? Because I agree with your latter point that particularly around really emergent tech, there's just no way for regulators to get in front of it. I just don't trust DC to have the expertise to do that. But even where we have technology that's kind of been operationalized and embedded in our society, let's say, describe social media, or let's say free media in Russia and Ukraine, let's get more granular to your point. We're actually watching the markets regulate themselves. I understand and I believe that there's a lot of back channeling happening between Ukrainian policymakers and activists, as well as DC policymakers and activists talking to, Nick at Meta or whomever the heads of policy are at FANG. But it seems like those large tech corporates are actually stepping into a space that DC and regulators aren't pushing them, right? They're not being told to either censor RT or to change behaviors around offering products in Russia. A lot of them seem to be doing this from a fair markets basis because they see what's happening at the consumer level and they can feel the temperature of the room changing. And granted, like I'm watching this in real time, just like anyone else. Would love to get questions from the audience specifically on this, but like Michael, that's kind of a direct refutation of your point. This is a place where the markets are actually leading the regulators. Is that fair?
I think that it's a really interesting point. I'm going to think about it for 2 seconds, then I'm going to respond.
John.
Oh, actually, sorry. Now I am ready. My thought train has left the station. We're ready. I think that it's in some ways it's encouraging because we all have a clear dog in this fight. But the point of regulation is that we shouldn't leave it up to companies to simply act, especially when they're acting in the moment of crisis. And I think a lot of the actions that have been taken around Ukraine, on the one hand, great. I don't see a lot of people standing up and saying, we need more RT or Sputnik in our lives, but there are really dangerous precedents being set. So when France or Germany says, hey, Facebook, you need to take down RT, we're all like, oh, good. Okay, that makes sense in the context of Ukraine. We think differently when it's a country like Vietnam or Turkey, which says to Facebook, you need to block BBC or VOA or whomever. And without clear regulation, it's almost impossible for companies to be able to navigate those waters. And so the precedent that they're setting today in the context of Ukraine means, I think, that there's going to be less freedom of expression going forward as other countries say, all right, you know what? If you're willing to block state media in this context, let's see if you're willing to block state media in that context. And maybe it makes sense to block RT, maybe it doesn't, but these are the sorts of consequences that we need to figure out. And so just having companies sort of act in the spur of the moment might be gratifying, but tends to be, over the long term, much more problematic without any kind of regulatory framework to guide. And I think when we talk about a regulatory framework, and this is one of my issues to a certain extent with responsible innovation, is all these terms have meaning in the eye of the beholder. Like, what does responsible mean? And what we believe at Amnesty is that these decisions need to be grounded in human rights. There is a clear framework for helping to balance a lot of these tensions between, on the one hand, for instance, if we're talking about Ukraine, the need to deal with hate speech or war propaganda, and on the other hand, the need for free expression. And so it's not just sort of we need regulation, we need responsible innovation, but these need to be grounded in human rights principles that themselves look at the consequences on not just all of us, but especially the consequences on those who are most vulnerable.
I'm going to put a finer point on your observation here. And John, I really want you to respond because we've had really interesting bilateral conversations on the importance and the difference between codifying these governance principles versus real-time firefighting when there is an actual emergency in a geography like we're seeing right now. Where does a VC fit in this? Should they be pushing for codification early on so that it's not just by the time, and here I'm quoting from, I believe the BBC, blonde haired, blue eyed refugees experiencing extreme violence. But to Michael's point, the long-term humanitarian crisis happening across a number of other non-Western, non-civilized societies is what we've seen. So where would you draw the line, right? Because is it Series A, is it Series B? Like, when do we expect basic stakeholder mapping and consequence scanning of something as powerful as, let's say, social media, right? Since we're choosing this example, to become part of the portfolio operations that a good GP, right, a best-in-class ESG GP would offer to a team?
Look, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the business that the portfolio company is in, right? So if the business is social media with an international reach, then a good GP should be having conversations with the leadership of that company about these risks, right? And I think, you look at the Ukraine situation, and I think, Michael, I don't remember if you used the word scrambling or something along those lines, right? Companies sort of scrambling. I think that's true of many companies. We put out some guidance this week to companies that we work with to try to give them some direction about how to walk through these decisions. But I do think one of the pieces of advice we gave folks is you should be assembling a governance. If you don't have one, you should essentially be assembling a governance process for how you will make these decisions, right? Who will you involve? How will you collect information about this evolving situation? And what are the values? What matters here for you? And we walk through a set of questions that we think are relevant for most or all companies. But I do think, I mean, fundamentally, I think, Sudhar, to your question, I mean, I think as regards the investor, but also as regards the founding team, the entrepreneurs, you really do need to game these things out, because the crisis that you ultimately face is not going to look like the one, it's not going to look like the last one. It's not really what is important is that you have a set of well-expressed values and a decision-making process that lets you evaluate how you're going to deal with these necessarily ad hoc and kind of nascent things. And I think you can expect, I think a good investor will help, particularly inexperienced founders, sort of have the foresight to see that this is the kind of thing that's going to happen, and you should think through it. Who are you going to, literally, who are you going to call, right, on this? And that's, I think, what we should be expecting.
I totally agree, and I think that in some ways regulation is important in certain contexts. But as John said, there's no regulation which is going to cover every situation, and the important thing is to have a process and guidelines for making decisions that aren't sort of off the cuff, where you do have, as John said earlier, guardrails. How do you balance these tensions? And I really appreciate this conversation, because it's made me think a lot. And in some ways, again, John, you and I agree on probably more than we disagree on, about the need for both founders and VCs to think about the longer term consequences of their actions, whether we're framing that in terms of human rights or ESG. I think where my disquiet comes from, and again, it has been surfaced through this conversation, which I really appreciate, is the centrality of human rights. And I think my struggle with sort of responsible innovation or tech ethics, or any one of a number of parallel conversations that are happening around sort of how can companies better, whether they're small or large, and how can VCs better identify and respond to these kinds of risks, is what is the framework that we're using? And frameworks like responsible innovation or tech ethics, they tend to be squishy. Whereas I think when we think about guidelines and what's really important, this gets back to, again, human rights due diligence, grounding those decisions in a human rights normative framework is, I think, not only much more powerful, but much more effective. And I'll give an example of what I mean. I mean, yes, whereas framework is grounded in, all right, what are the human rights implications and what are the human rights requirements of the situation? I think it leads to a more rigorous process and better outcomes.
I'm gonna take moderator's privilege here and dive in and say, I agree that there probably hasn't been as much focus at any single GP, including that of General Catalyst, on a really thorough portfolio analysis from a social climate justice perspective. And that's really the takeaway from your work for me.
Yeah.
And that I think that General Catalyst has stepped into trying to show more ownership and leadership here. So my hope would be that there is more thoughtfulness around specific portfolio investments there. So John, don't feel like you have to respond.
Yeah, no, but there's a couple things there. I did want to, Michael. I'm not here as a representative. Just to be clear, I think it was said I'm not here as a representative.
And General Catalyst, I say it because we've mentioned them before, but to give credit where it's due, I think it's great that firms like GC are taking first steps down this road, and I think that that's to be lauded. Sorry, John. Go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think a couple of things. One, it strikes me, that even when you use the framework of human rights for due diligence purposes, there remains a fair amount of squishiness in the application of that, particularly to early stage businesses, right? And so at the end of the day, I'm not arguing that it's not a good framework. I'm not arguing that it is, but I think there is a certain the question here to me is much more, particularly when we're talking about investing in early stage companies. How do you create transparency and accountability? Because through whatever lens you are going to evaluate these things, you're going to need those things, right? You're going to need some ability to sort of see these things. I think for us, that's what we at Responsible Innovation Lab, in some sense, I very much agree with the idea that if we were to end the conversation with terms like responsible innovation or ethical tech or whatever, and go no further to codify what we think that means, then I agree. I mean, then it becomes it's a sort of just so story of goodness that I think is not particularly meaningful. We think you need to go beyond that, and we are trying to do that. So that's kind of thing one. I will say one of the we're implicitly, and we've used the word risk a number of times in this conversation, but I just want to kind of call out, we are very focused on the risk side of the equation, and I think one of the things that we think about with responsible innovation is, I go back to this idea that innovation driven by ambitious technology companies is a superpower for the world, right? It is going to, we were talking before we started about, it is going, at its best, it will empower people. Bad word, I know you don't like that word, Michael. It will help groups to gain power who have not had it before. It will help us to solve aspects of climate change and other things if used well, right? So there's a really way, there's a way in which responsible innovation is not merely about avoiding risks, it's about channeling this societal superpower toward things which are societally beneficial. We talked a bunch about GC, so I'll just reference one of the things that they're trying to do with their health assurance initiative is actually, they have set themselves a goal to drive down the GDP of healthcare, right? They actually, which is a weird thing for a for-profit business to do in some ways, right? But it's a fundamental idea that to be responsible is to align better outcomes with lower costs for society, right? Like that's when I think about responsible innovation, I want to be careful that it's not purely about risk avoidance. Well, there are plenty of risks to avoid. It's really about the application of this to societally beneficial and I think in many cases a positive thing. So I think that's worth clarifying.
Last thought on that, because I know your two co-founders at Responsible Innovation Labs are also co-founders of Commure, the health tech company that, to your point, is, I would say, not just riding the secular trends around kind of egalitarian access to better health technology, but actually pushing for it. So there's something really interesting that's happening that's bleeding between impact investments and social enterprises that are actually mandated to try and accomplish something positive in the world, all the way to the end of the spectrum, which is very reactive, to your point, John, very risk-oriented, cover your ass, fiduciary duty-oriented end of the commercial spectrum. And so there are going to be GPs that play on both ends and have a defense company in their portfolio, and they're trying to push through the investment thesis to explain away the muddiness and hopefully, I would say, get clearer and clearer over time. So actually, I really do think that we can end beating a dead horse on the GC front and say that they are stepping into the moment, and it is an idiosyncratic portfolio, but still perhaps one that is best in class for the space. I want to push you though, John. You've referred repeatedly to the 5 pillars of Responsible Innovation Labs, but you've forgotten one. So on your own website,
innovating intentionally really is
technology's world-changing power must be wielded with care. We have an obligation to consider the impacts our technologies will have on the world and to build rigor and negative on how it's is tech, right? If we were going to identify a few portfolio services that the human rights activists and the technology founders and leaders like RIL would agree should be coming to the forefront, what do you guys think are the basic qualitative trainings that we would want every starry-eyed future unicorn founder to have at their disposal? What should we be pushing the GPs to give to their portfolio companies? Resources or accountability, right? Stick or carrot.
I mean, I think that there's a really important process point. And I think that even at an early stage, what we need is for VCs to have a process that includes the company around what are the potential negative consequences. Even though we can't see perfectly into the future, that's a conversation that at least needs to be had before an investment is made. And that's where I think looking at what has happened to other companies in that sector, other companies with similar business models, other companies with similar customer segments can be very powerful, saying, all right, we do have comps. What are some of the human rights implications of other similarly situated companies? Are those a risk here, and how can we address them? I think the other critical process point is not just pre-investment, but post-investment. To your point, Sudhar, a company at a seed or an A stage is going to grow and change tremendously. And the responsibility of a VC firm doesn't end just when the check is cut. And this is part of what, when we talk about adequate human rights due diligence, when we talk about what the UN guiding principles require, it's this idea, again, to go back to some of the language that we used around transparency, making sure that there are regular checkpoints to look at what are the operations, what's the strategy, and what are the implications going forward.
I'll just add, I know we're short on time here. I agree with that. I think one of the things that I think venture firms should do very early in the life of the company is get the founders together and really spend some time to talk through what is the good we think we are doing in the world. What are the values we have in this company, and how might it go wrong? I think you have to, at some point, it's a flight of imagination, but you have to do it, and you have to articulate it, and you have to write it down. And then you have to have a process for coming back to it on some regular basis. And companies should be setting metrics for not just the good they want to do, not just the growth they want to have, the profits they want to have, whatever, the users they want to have, but actually, if it went wrong, what would it look like? And how will we measure for it? I think there's a certain kind of rigor that people need to build into thinking about the downside, not just the upside. And I think that's a part of what the relationship with investors and companies needs to begin to encompass.
Fantastic. I like that we're ending, I think, on a really similar note. You're both speaking to process, you're both speaking to codification, and in a lot of rights, I mean, if you start with mission, vision, values, a good appreciation of diversity, equity, inclusion, that naturally leads you to stakeholder mapping and then really rigorous consequence scanning. And if we'd had that, would we have been even faster off the block for Ukraine? Would things have happened similarly in Myanmar and Syria historically, if that had been codified, call it 5-6 years ago, is a really great open question. All right, lightning round. We have 1 more minute. I'm going to take my 1 more minute. What are each of you going to try and commit your organization to do in support of venture capital firms in the next 6 to 12 months on this issue of responsible tech? Really fast, and then we'll hang up.
I'll go first. We're going to get out a set of standards that reflect all of what we think are the dimensions of responsible innovation, which incorporates a lot of human rights.
Wonderful, Michael.
And we don't partner with, to John's earlier point, we are outside, right? That said, we have research coming up looking at an issue that we raised earlier, which is the role of LPs, and in particular, university endowments. And to what extent are they and should they require that the GPs and VCs in which they invest have an explicit human rights due diligence policy?
I love it. We're ending with the carrot. We're ending with the stick. For those of you on the line who are interested in staying in touch, please reach out to Amnesty International, to Responsible Innovation Labs, to Lucid Capitalism. We are so excited to continue the conversation. Thank you all for joining today.
Thank you, Sudhar. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Great conversation. Thanks, you guys.